we're not just working a shift and then going home and it's over. There's always ways that you could do it better.
Welcome to Hallway Conversations. We're a trio of educators who have plenty of questions about teaching and learning and school culture, and we believe in the value of collaboration and reflection as we seek to keep growing as teachers. So this podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about issues in education and why they might matter to Christian educators. Welcome to the conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Hallway Conversations. My name is Matt Beamers.
I'm Abby DeGroat.
And I'm Dave Mulder.
For those of you new here, we are three friends who found each other one day in a hallway in Iowa, and one of us suggested we do a podcast, and now here we are.
Here we are.
We take education pretty seriously, but we try not to take ourselves too seriously. And our primary goal is that you are encouraged in both your teaching life and your everyday walking around life. Also, we love feedback, and you can send any and all feedback to hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. That's hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. So feel free to come at us and tell us what we did well or what we need to do better, or simply suggest topics or questions that we can discuss. Or you can even send us an email and just say hi and tell us where in the world you're listening to this podcast right now. Today we continue with our series, Flourishing Together, a book by Andy, Wolfe, and Lynn Swaner. Unbelievably, Dave and Abby, this is part 5 of our 5-part series.
That's right.
And I know that we have really enjoyed and appreciated this book, and are so thankful for the good work that Andy and Lynn have done. So Andy and Lynn, thank you so much. Dave and Abby, as you know, part 5 is on well-being, and I think for all of us, this resonated in a pretty deep way. Mm-hmm. And as you know, we usually begin with a check-in question, so it's a little bit heavier maybe, but related to the reading. And how do you know, for you two, how do you know when your work-life rhythm, I know some people talk about work-life balance. My friend Darren Speaks often talks about work-life rhythm, and I really like that. So how do you know when your work-life rhythm is out of whack, when it's not so well with your soul, and what strategies do you use when it all feels like too much?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I just want to pick up, I really love that language of work-life rhythm. I've grappled for a long time that idea of work-life balance, as if my work is something unpleasant that I need to balance out with good stuff in my life. And my work is something I love too. And so I'm a musician, right? And I think about it in terms of like, if I'm playing with a band, like we got to stay in tempo together. And how do I make sure that I'm not racing on ahead or lagging behind, right? To keep these things in rhythm. So that said, this is something I really struggle with, right? Because as much as I love my work, it can really consume more than its fair share, right? And so both of those things are true, right? So for me, how do I know when things start getting out of sync or out of rhythm like that? I find I get snappish with people, and it's about this, not about that, right? That the thing that I'm actually frustrated is not the thing that I'm taking it out on the people around me, right? I had this with my daughter just the other night, right? And it was a very small thing, and I'm just like, can you just please take care of the dishes? Like, because that's usually the way she'll unload the dishwasher and I'll load it. But I can't get onto my thing until she's done with it, right? And so then I'm just like snappish with her about that. And it wasn't even about that. I was frustrated about something else entirely, but I realized that for myself, right? And then when I noticed that, it's like, oh, honey, I'm sorry. That's not how this is supposed to go, and I'm not mad at you, right? And so I'm going to humble myself and say so. But that's frustrating in the moment. It's like I just kind of feel that tension.
No, it's good. So naming it is a big part of it.
Definitely for me.
How about you, Abby?
Yeah, I think I tend to find myself escaping and zoning out when I get overwhelmed, right? Like I find it difficult to tackle anything because I'm like frozen almost, right? And one thing that I have found really helpful is to break up things and set reasonable timestamps and then really stick with it, right? So that I don't allow myself to sit in that indecision and overwhelm, right? Like I'm going to grade for 60 minutes and it's going to take, I think, I have, again, a pretty good idea of how long things take me.
Right.
So, these papers are going to take me 10 minutes a piece. I'm going to get 6 done. And then I'm going to let myself do something else for a while, right? So I think setting smaller goals to really break up those big chunks of things into more manageable pieces is kind of my go-to strategy, I would say, when I'm finding myself frozen with indecision and overwhelm, which happens sometimes. Yeah, or procrastination, right? Like just do 6 of them.
Yeah. It probably is better. I mean, that's a whole different conversation. That probably makes for better assessment.
Yeah, right.
Too, right?
Yeah.
Right. I know, like you're fresh, and if you just take them chunks at a time, like I know that if I assess the same thing over and over, it's like, yeah, I can feel myself like getting looser about some things, or just not giving it the attention it needs, and that's just a good practice, even from an assessment point of view. I know for me, one of the things that I know when it feels like too much for me, I actually shared this with you right before we started today, is that I can get absent-minded and forgetful. Like I start like little details, and I have to work hard at that. I've gotten way better at that in my life, and I just get so irritated with myself. So I'm very ungracious when I get too tired or it feels too much. It's like, you should be better than that. I'm hard on myself. But I can also go the other way, in that I can start blaming people for. I can just be like, well, if you would have,
right,
then I wouldn't have. And I know that. Like, I start telling myself a story in my mind that this would have gone a different way if someone else would have done something different.
Right.
When in reality, I'm actually in control of so much of that. And so for me, sometimes when I feel myself getting into that space, I just remove myself from a situation. I go for a walk. I go for a drive. I just I need to step back before I say something stupid. And so I just hey, just step back and then try to reset. So, guys, when I was reading through this, so I think we said that at the beginning. I enjoyed this whole book, but I found part 5 so captivating, and part of it is because I think I've just really thought a lot about what does good rest look like, as opposed to, because I think there's actually good rest and bad rest, if that makes sense. And I was thinking about a book I read a number of years ago by Mark Buchanan. He's a writer who is on Vancouver Island on the west coast of British Columbia. And he has this wonderful book. It's called The Rest of God, Restoring Your Soul by Restoring Your Sabbath. And first of all, I love the title, Restoring Your Soul by Restoring Your Sabbath. And maybe we can put a link in the show notes, Dave. But he has this line in there, and he says, we spend most of our lives working. And we there is collectively, not necessarily teachers, but I'm reading in the context of teaching and leading. We spend most of our lives working, and when we're not working, we spend most of that time thinking about it, complaining about it, fretting about it, preparing for it, recovering from it. And then he has this wonderful line: we feel guilty when we don't do enough, and we feel resentful when we do too much.
Oh, man.
So we feel guilty when we don't do enough, resentful when we do too much. And I don't know, I'm going to name that I'm not sure there's an answer to this question, but when I read this chapter and I thought about Buchanan, the question came to my mind: as teachers, why is our relationship with work and rest so complex? So why as teachers, and I'm going to assume this is true outside of teaching too, for a lot of people. So. But I'm just thinking about it as teachers. It feels like we have such a complicated relationship with our work, but I also feel like we have such a complicated relationship with rest. And I'm just wondering if you can share some insights on that, because I do. That's my question. And I just feel like I've been wondering about that since I've read part 5.
Yeah, I think my answer is because I care about my craft, right? So, and I think we're not just working a shift and then going home and it's over. There's always ways that you could do it better, right? There are always tweaks that you could make, or updates, or readings you could add, or things you could learn, or
more feedback for the
right,
students.
more feedback, quicker feedback. And so I think that's part of the nature of it, right? I could read and practice forever and still have more to learn. And so I think that unlimited nature of it makes the work, and also because you're dealing with human beings in front of you. Right? I'm not assembling furniture. I am shaping people's ideas, right? And thinking, and that feels heavy.
Yeah. You carry that.
Yeah.
And you can't take it lightly because, like, we talk about education as formation. So what am I doing that's forming students, whether I'm aware of it or ignorant to it? The things that I'm doing are going to form them in particular ways. So we should take that with the gravity that it demands, right?
How about you, Dave? Other thoughts?
Yeah.
Because it is a complicated. At least maybe I'm overthinking it, but I do feel like it's a complicated relationship.
No, I totally agree with you on that, Matt. And I think for myself, this is something I've shared with students too, right? Like this whole idea from Parker Palmer, we teach who we are.
Yeah.
Well, this gets troublesome because teaching is intensely personal.
Yeah.
Work, right? The things that I'm doing, I am putting myself out on display every time that I step in front of a group of students. And yet, it's also intensely private work, right? It's very personal, but it's very private because I have like my whole private universe of my ideas that are happening here. And then I have to make those public somehow because I'm doing this work in front of people. I'm doing it for people. And I guess that's maybe my answer to that question too, right? Like, why do I have such a complicated relationship with the work? It's because it's me.
Yeah.
Like, so much of the work is me.
Tied to our identity and who we are.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so if I'm trying to be an integral whole person, well, how whole should I be when I'm in front of my class with my students, right? Like there's parts that I still keep to myself because it is private work too, right? Like, it's complicated.
It is complicated. No, I wonder about that. They ask Andy and Lynn ask a question later. It's framed something like what happens when you become your job title, right? And that gets at identity.
Absolutely.
And I feel that. We feel that in all of our lives. I can remember at some point years ago wanting to go to a church where none of my students went. And I love my students. But I actually felt like it was going to allow me to love them more, to actually get a Sabbath rest from them or even from their families or people because
from that role.
Yeah, from that role because you don't see these people during the week, obviously. So now's their time to talk about school, which I understand. And I've done it as a parent. Like, I get this, right? It's like, well, I never get to see your teacher. So, hey, like, let's talk. How's it going? What's going on? And it's a reminder for me. Like, when that started happening to me, it was like I just became resistant to it, right? Because I was always Mr. Beamers. And, right? So I have it now, actually, where when we have friends who have kids, no matter how young, I really insist on them calling me by my first name. Like that for me has become really important because, and I'll joke with them and I say, hey, everywhere I go, I'm Mr. Beamers. Please call me Matt because I've got enough people who see me as Mr. Beamers, and it was really beautiful. We have one of our friends has a daughter. She's in grade 5 or 6, and I asked her I knew she was into drawing maps, and so she drew me a map of British Columbia where we came from and put all labels on it. And on the back it said to Matt from Sophia, and that was the most most meaningful part of that. It's just like I can just be Matt, and because I do think we get so caught up often in our job titles, and I just think what you said, Abby, resonates. Like there's always more to do, right? Anybody who takes their work seriously, no matter what they're doing, actually always sees ways to either be more creative, to be more efficient, to pour more into relationships, to the point, when you finally get permission to rest, you almost don't know what to do with it. Like,
that's right.
I can remember Bev making fun of me the first week of July because it was the grumpiest I ever was in the year because it was the first week after school let out, and I didn't know how to rest. I literally did not know how to rest, and you have to learn to do that, to give yourself permission.
Right. And that's the thing. Teachers have such a terrible time. Right? That was the flip side of your original question. I think I'll point the finger at myself with this. Right? What other profession is it more work for you to take a sick day?
Right. Oh,
than
absolutely.
Teaching, right? Like I would much prefer to just show up sick and just gut it out and get through the day because it's so much more work to plan. And so that just feels like it sets up an unhealthy, way of being, though, right? Because if it is going to be more work, then I'm not going to rest anyway. I'm going to wind up exhausting myself. And it's complicated. I get that. I don't know of any way to fix that situation because of the nature of what we're trying to do. And like you were saying, Abby, it's not like working on the line where you're just assembling something. It's like we're actually trying to shape and form ways of being in the world for our students.
And yet, and I think Andy and Lynn talk about this, when teachers are burned out, when teachers are sick, there's a correlation to the impact on student learning,
absolutely.
right?
They call it like a symbiotic relationship, right?
Totally. Yeah, and I read that, and I know in a class, there was a study out of the University of British Columbia. It says that in classrooms in which teachers experience more burnout or feelings of emotional exhaustion, the study actually shows that students' cortisol levels are elevated, right?
Well, so higher, feeling more stressed.
Yeah, totally, right? So students carry our stress when we feel it. So again, like I've said this before, right? Like what's best for students is actually maybe doing what's best for teachers and rethinking schedules and finding ways to reduce stress, because it correlates with better learning. But I think that's so antithetical to how our school systems are set up.
The way the whole thing's set up.
Go more, do more, be faster, more content, right?
Right. And it also kind of highlights that you can't just decide as an individual.
Totally.
Right? Because you're wrapped up in a system.
Right.
And so I don't know how to change that.
No, and like Andy and Lynn talk about that too, right? The sense of flourishing schools, right? How do you make the whole school a place of flourishing? Well, okay, students are going to flourish if teachers are flourishing, if schools are flourishing, right? It's all interrelated in it.
Guys, is there anything else that stood out for you? And I mean, there's a lot of stuff in these chapters.
There's so much.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite bits, every section of the book they have a chapter where they use a metaphor in some way, and that just really resonates for me too. And in this section they used the jars of clay metaphor from 2 Corinthians. And jars of clay is my favorite 90s Christian band.
That totally resonated with me as I read it too. I'm like, oh.
But the bit where they talk about the meaning of that, in the sense that verse in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 7 is like, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this power is from God and not from us, right? And I love that so much because it's just such an important reminder. All the things we're talking about here, and as much as I put my identity, there's always more we can do, all these things. Yeah, I'm just a crackpot though, right? It's not me.
Right.
It's Jesus in me and His light shining out. So I'm this cracked pot, right? But light shines through those cracks too, right?
Yeah.
And I'm broken. I'm fragile. I'm frail. Yeah. But thanks be to God.
And those buts, right? Right?
Yeah.
Are impressed but not crushed.
Yes.
Yeah.
They go through.
Perplexed but not in despair. Yep.
I loved that imagery.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the central points that they made too is that if we don't address well-being, much of what we do when it comes to teaching and learning won't matter.
That's right.
And so I think that's important for teachers to remember too.
Yeah.
And well-being of our students, but our own as well, because of that symbiotic relationship, right? So actually doing more and being more without resting does the opposite of what I want it to do.
Yeah.
And that's important to remember, because I need to be well in order to teach well.
One of the things that I felt a bit of tension with as I read, this idea of like the blessing of serving others, the blessing of being in community. And I think at one point it's this idea of like, hey, it's what can we give, not what can we gain. And yet I feel this tension because I feel like we're really good at asking teachers to give more. And so I'm trying to find out that balance of maybe do we ask less? Do we ask less? I don't know. This was just a bit of a tension to say, hey, we're in the business of giving, of pouring into others. And I know that there's a blessing that comes from that. But also, how do we put boundaries? It goes back to what you say, like the plate is the same size.
Right.
There's only so many hours, and we keep adding, and we want to give. And I know like there's so much blessing in giving and serving others. But at what point do we also say I have nothing left to give? And is that okay?
So I was flipping through the book as you're saying that, because they had a great bit in one of the reflections at the end of this section. This is in the section Flourishing Schools, reflection number 2. And the quote that I want to pull out here: stopping things can be one of the most powerful forces in releasing flourishing in our schools. Stopping things. Yeah. And it just has me thinking about my grandpa Mulder. He was a consummate gardener, and he was always trimming trees and things like that. And he would talk about the importance of pruning. Pruning leads to flourishing. Mm-hmm. And how often do we actually remove things from teachers' plates? How often do we actually remove things from administrators' plates? From our students' plates, frankly. They're always piling on more and more and more. If we're going to add something, we must take something away, too. Because if we're serious about flourishing, that means we're going to have to trim things out. We're going to have to prune things.
One of the other questions that they asked is this idea of, like, how do we slow down and not rush into the curriculum? I mean, that was a really good question that they asked at the end of one of those chapters. And for me, it was just like, how do we slow down and not rush into whatever it is actually, right? So how do we, is it possible even to slow down as a teacher in our classroom, and maybe thinking about that in building culture in a classroom, but I even think about that as a staff, right? How do we slow down and build trust, build well-being? How do we create things in the schedule, or even provide resources? I visited a school overseas a number of years ago, and in their staff room they had like an exercise bike, they had a treadmill, they had all this wonderful furniture. Like it wasn't like, it actually was the architecture of the staff room, because they talk about good architecture for good learning. Right. But I even think about that in a staff room, right? It's like, hey, what does that look like in terms of architecture and how we design it in terms of rest? But so just that question of what can we do to slow down? There is individual choices we make, right? Like, what are we doing with our time? And I know for me, like, I'm making choices around whether it's assessing, whether I'm coming into my office on Saturday. And there's a season where I do need to do that. It's just really busy. Yeah. But even as our teachers are stepping into summer, hey, what parts of my recreation, recreating my restoration do I have control over, and what choices can I make that might lead to more wholeness? And then as school leaders to say, what choices can they make that might allow their teachers, invite them into a more whole way of being? Friends, we know your time is valuable, and we want to thank you for joining us today for another hallway conversation. Whether it is this day, this week, this month, or this school year, we hope that the Lord gives you what you stand in need of, especially for those of you who are about to end. And as you go, we just want to send you with this blessing. God go before you to lead you. God go behind you to protect you. God go beneath you to support you. God go beside you to befriend you. Do not be afraid. May the blessing of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be upon you. Do not be afraid. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Amen. Thanks for listening, everybody. We hope you have a good week.
This podcast was quite literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is an independent podcast created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Thanks for listening.
Okay.
This is terrible.
Yep.
So I had friends when I was in college, and they had a cover band. Right?
Oh, my word.
It was great. And they called themselves the Lids because they covered jars of clay.
Oh, my word. There's your outtake.
Oh, that's funny.